Amon Crawford stood at the entrance of his pit den on the morning of March 7, 1779, watching 3 feet of fresh snow blanket the Appalachian ridges. The storm had raged for 11 days straight, the longest and coldest anyone in these mountains had ever seen. What happened during those 11 days would prove that sometimes the best way to survive above ground is to live below it. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals another forgotten survival technique that saved lives on the American frontier. The cabin door was frozen shut. Amon Crawford had to put his shoulder into it 3 times before the ice broke free and the door swung inward. The cold that poured out was worse than the February wind outside. That told him everything before he even stepped inside. Peter Drummond sat in the corner near the fireplace, wrapped in both their blankets. He had been dead for at least 2 days, maybe 3. The fire had burned out completely. The interior temperature felt colder than the air outside, as if the cabin itself had become a tomb of frozen wood and stone. Amon stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move. They had built this cabin together the previous autumn. 4 walls of notched logs, a stone chimney, a solid plank door. It had seemed sturdy enough. They had survived January in it without major problems. But February had brought cold unlike anything either of them had experienced. The kind of cold that made your breath freeze in your beard, the kind that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Peter had stayed at the cabin 2 days earlier while Amon checked their distant trap lines. The plan was simple. Amon would be gone overnight, back by midday. Peter would keep the fire going, stay warm, and process the pelts they had accumulated. When Amon returned, they would work together to finish the season and head down to the settlements before the worst of winter arrived, except the worst had already arrived. Amon stepped closer and examined the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 6 winters in these mountains. The firewood was stacked neatly against the wall. Peter had plenty of fuel. The fireplace showed evidence of a large fire, recently extinguished. The blankets were wrapped tight around Peter's body. Everything suggested a man trying desperately to stay warm. The problem was not what Peter had done. The problem was the cabin itself. Amon looked up at the roof. Gaps between the logs showed daylight. The chinking, a mixture of mud and moss they had applied in autumn, had dried and cracked during the winter. Every gap was a place where heat escaped and cold air entered. The door, solid as it seemed, fit loosely in its frame. Wind could pass around the edges. The single window, covered with oiled rawhide, provided minimal insulation. The cabin was a sieve. Heat from the fire rose to the ceiling and leaked out through 100 small gaps. Cold air poured in at ground level through the same openings. No matter how large a fire Peter built, he was trying to heat the entire outdoors. The cabin could not hold warmth. Amon dragged Peter's body outside and buried him in a shallow grave on the hillside above their camp. The ground was frozen too hard to dig deep. He marked the spot with stones and stood in the wind, looking down at the cabin that had killed his partner. Something changed in Amon that afternoon. Most men would have accepted Peter's death as bad luck, the cost of frontier living, an unfortunate tragedy. Amon saw it differently. Peter had not died from bad luck. He had died from bad design. The year 1779 marked the 4th winter of the American Revolution. While armies fought along the eastern seaboard, the Appalachian frontier remained largely untouched by organized warfare. But the mountains had their own ways of killing men. Amon Crawford had come to these ridges in 1773 as a young man of 22. He was Scots-Irish by heritage, born in Pennsylvania to parents who had crossed the Atlantic, seeking land and freedom from English landlords. Like many sons of immigrants, Amon found the settled regions too crowded and too controlled. The mountains called to men who wanted space and independence. The Central Appalachians in 1779 were not wilderness in the pure sense. Cherokee and Shawnee had lived in these valleys for generations. They had trails, seasonal camps, and an intimate knowledge of how to survive conditions that killed unprepared Europeans. But ongoing conflicts had pushed most native populations away from the highest ridges, leaving a contested zone where white settlers, hunters, and trappers established precarious footholds. Eamon had partnered with Peter Drummond 2 years earlier. Peter was older, nearly 40, and had experience trapping in the Northern Territories. Together, they had worked a productive territory along a network of creeks that fed into the new river. Beaver were still plentiful. Bear and deer provided meat and hides. A man could make a living if he was careful and competent. They had built their cabin in a valley protected from the worst winds, near water, surrounded by timber. The location was ideal by conventional standards. The construction followed patterns both men had learned from other frontiersmen. Notch the logs at the corners, stack them with the bark still on for faster construction, fill gaps with whatever was available, build a chimney from fieldstone and clay. Create a structure that would keep out rain and provide shelter from wind. It was adequate for autumn. It had seemed acceptable during the early winter. But when the deep cold arrived in February, adequate became deadly. Eamon spent 3 days after Peter's burial simply existing in a state of numb routine. He maintained the fire. He ate sparingly from their supplies. He did not check trap lines or process pelts. He sat in the cabin that had killed his partner and thought about heat. Fire produced warmth. That was obvious. But where did the warmth go? It rose toward the ceiling, driven by natural convection. Hot air was lighter than cold air. It accumulated at the top of any enclosed space. In a well-built structure, that hot air remained trapped, gradually warming the entire interior. In a poorly built structure, the hot air escaped through gaps in the roof and walls, replaced constantly by cold air flowing in at ground level. Every cabin Eamon had ever seen, including this one, was poorly built by that standard. They were constructed for speed and convenience, not thermal efficiency. Nobody thought carefully about heat retention because most winters did not demand it. Men survived in drafty cabins by building larger fires and wearing heavy clothes indoors, until they did not survive. Eamon left the cabin on the Bronx, 4th day after Peter's death, and walked into the winter forest with no specific destination. He needed to move, to think, to understand something that nagged at the edges of his awareness. Animals survived these winters. Not just survived, but thrived. Bears denned through the coldest months in complete comfort. Groundhogs disappeared into burrows and emerged healthy in spring. Foxes raised pups in underground chambers during weather that killed unprepared humans. How? He found a bear den purely by accident, nearly stepping on the entrance hidden beneath a fallen log. The opening was small, barely large enough for the animal to squeeze through. Eamon knelt and felt the air coming from inside. It was noticeably warmer than the surrounding atmosphere. Not hot, but distinctly less cold. He put his hand 6 inches into the entrance. The temperature difference was unmistakable. The bear was not inside. This was an old den from a previous season. Eamon cleared snow from the entrance and examined the construction. The bear had dug down into the hillside, creating a chamber below ground level. The entrance tunnel angled downward before opening into the main space. That angle was important. Cold air sank, warm air rose. The downward entrance trapped warm air in the main chamber while letting cold air drain away. Over the next week, Eamon found and examined 7 more animal dens. Groundhog burrows, fox dens, even a large hollow beneath tree roots where some creature had excavated a living space. They all shared common features. They were below ground level. They had small entrances relative to the interior space. They were insulated by earth on all sides. He remembered something a Cherokee hunter had told him 3 years earlier during a chance encounter near a trading post. The old man had been amused by the cabin Eamon was building at the time. "White men always build tall," the hunter had said. "Tall cabins catch wind. Wind steals heat. Smart people build low. Best people build into ground. Ground does not freeze deep. Ground stays warm when air is cold." Eamon had dismissed the comment as cultural difference. Now he understood it as practical physics. He began paying attention to the ground itself. During a brief thaw, he dug through snow and frost to expose bare earth. 6 inches down, the soil was cold but not frozen. A foot down, it was noticeably warmer. 2 feet down, he could hold his bare hand against the earth without discomfort. The ground held heat that the air could not steal. The realization came together one evening as he sat in the drafty cabin trying to stay warm despite a roaring fire. He was fighting the air temperature. The cabin exposed him to air on all sides, separated only by thin walls full of gaps. Every surface of the cabin was in contact with freezing air, conducting cold inward as fast as the fire could produce heat. What if he removed the air from the equation? What if he built into the ground instead of on top of it? Eamon selected his site in early March, as soon as the ground began to thaw enough to work. He chose a south-facing slope half a mile from the failed cabin, elevated above the creek to avoid flooding, with clear sight lines in 3 directions. The location was defensible and well-drained. More importantly, the hillside itself would become part of his shelter. Luther Hayes arrived on the 3rd day of excavation and stood watching Eamon dig with unconcealed amusement. Hayes was a mountaineer of 15 years' experience, respected throughout the scattered community of trappers and hunters. He had survived situations that killed lesser men. His opinion carried weight. "You are digging a grave," Hayes said. "That is a hole for a dead man, not a living one." Eamon paused and leaned on his shovel. "It is a shelter that uses the ground for insulation. The earth stays warm when the air is cold," Hayes laughed. "The earth is cold right now. I can see frost still in the soil you are moving. You will freeze in that hole faster than in any cabin." "The frost is only at the surface," Eamon said. 2 feet down, the ground is warmer than the air. 3 feet down, it will not freeze even in the worst cold. I will be surrounded by earth that holds heat instead of air that steals it." "You will be buried alive when that dirt collapses on you," Hayes said. "Or you will drown when spring rain fills your hole like a well." "This is madness." Other visitors came as word spread through the mountains. Owen Pritchard, a settler with a cabin 5 miles south, rode up to see what Eamon was doing. He sat on his horse and shook his head at the rectangular pit, taking shape in the hillside. "A man builds a cabin that stands proud," Pritchard said. "Something you can see, something that shows you made your mark. You are digging yourself into the ground like an animal. Where is the pride in that?" "Pride does not keep a man warm," Eamon replied. "Peter Drummond had pride. He is dead. I would rather be alive in a hole than frozen in a proud cabin." Pritchard rode away without another word. The excavation took 2 weeks of hard labor. Eamon dug into the hillside, creating a space roughly 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 7 feet from floor to ceiling at the highest point. The ceiling sloped slightly toward the entrance for water drainage. He cut the entrance at an angle, creating a short descending tunnel that opened into the main chamber. The design was deliberate. Cold air would sink down the tunnel and flow out the entrance. Warm air would rise and stay trapped in the higher rear portion of the chamber. He piled the excavated dirt nearby. It would become part of the roof structure later. Nothing was wasted. Every element served multiple purposes. The pit provided shelter. The removed earth provided insulation and structural material. The hillside itself became 3 walls that required no construction. The earthen walls of the pit were stable in dry conditions, but Eamon knew they would not remain that way. Spring rain would soften the soil. Freeze and thaw cycles would crack and crumble the surfaces. Without reinforcement, the walls would eventually collapse inward, burying everything inside. He needed a retaining system that would hold the earth in place permanently. Stone was abundant. The hillside was full of rocks ranging from fist-sized to pieces requiring 2 hands to lift. Eamon spent 5 days gathering stones, selecting each one for shape and size. He wanted flat surfaces that would stack with minimal gaps. Round river rocks were useless for this purpose. Angular stones broken from bedrock were ideal. He began at the base of the entrance tunnel, stacking stones in a drywall technique he had learned from a Scottish mason years earlier. No mortar was used. Each stone was placed to bear weight on the stones below it. Gaps were filled with smaller rocks. The wall leaned slightly into the earth bank, using the soil's weight to help stabilize the structure. The work was slow and required constant adjustment. A wall that looked solid could prove unstable when weight was applied. Eamon would sometimes dismantle an entire section and rebuild it when he found a weak point. He was building something that would support not just earth pressure from behind, but also the weight of the roof that would eventually sit on top. Luther Hayes returned while Eamon was building the stone walls. He watched in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You are putting more work into this hole than most men put into an entire cabin," Hayes said. "Why not just build something normal, something proven?" "Because proven methods killed Peter," Eamon said without looking up from his work. "I watched my partner freeze to death in a proven cabin while sitting next to a proven fireplace burning proven firewood. I am done with proven." Hayes shook his head. "You will die in this pit when the roof collapses under snow, or when rain floods it, or when you cannot get enough air and you suffocate. There are reasons men build above ground. There are reasons animals den below ground," Eamon replied. "They survive winters that kill livestock in barns. A bear in a den stays warmer than a cow in a shed. Why? Because bears are built for it," Hayes said. "Men are not. Men are built to think," Eamon said, "to learn, to adapt. I am adapting." Hayes left without further comment, but his expression made his opinion clear. Eamon was wasting time and effort on a dangerous experiment that would likely kill him. The stone walls took 3 weeks to complete. When finished, they rose from floor level to approximately 5 feet high, creating a stable retaining system for the earthen banks. The walls were not uniform or pretty. They looked rough and primitive. But they were solid. Eamon could push against them with his full weight and feel no movement. The earth behind them was contained and supported. The door frame was critical. It would support the entire roof structure while also serving as the entrance point. Eamon selected 2 straight logs, each roughly 8 inches in diameter and 9 feet long. He sank them 3 feet into the ground on either side of the entrance tunnel, creating vertical posts that would not shift or settle. The depth was important. Frost could heave shallower posts out of alignment. 3 feet put the base below the frost line. Across the top of these posts, he laid a horizontal header beam, a single log 10 feet long and equally thick. He notched the vertical posts to receive the beam, creating a joint that distributed weight evenly. The beam would carry the load of the entire roof, transferring it down through the posts and into the ground. He secured the connection using wooden pegs driven through drilled holes, locking the 3 pieces together into a rigid frame. The frame looked absurdly overbuilt for such a small entrance. Most cabin doors were hung on simple wooden frames, barely strong enough to support the door itself. Eamon's frame could have supported a horse standing on top of it. That was intentional. The roof would be heavy. Snow would add more weight. The frame needed to carry all of it without sagging or failing. With the structural frame complete, Eamon turned his attention to insulation. This was where the real innovation would prove itself or fail completely. He needed to seal every gap, trap dead air, and create barriers that would hold heat inside while keeping cold outside. He started with the gaps between the stones in his retaining walls. He gathered moss from the north sides of trees where it grew thick and damp. He packed this moss into every crack and crevice in the stonework, stuffing it deep with a stick. The moss would dry and compress, creating a seal that blocked air movement while remaining slightly flexible. Next came grass. Not fresh green grass, but the long dried stalks from the previous year's growth. He cut armfuls of this material from open meadows and carried it back to the pit. He bundled the grass into tight sheaves and wedged these bundles between the stone walls and the earthen banks behind them. The grass created dead air pockets, spaces where air could not circulate. Still, air was an excellent insulator. Moving air stole heat. Trapped air held it. Over the grass and moss, against the interior surface of the stone walls, Eamon began applying clay. He found a deposit of heavy blue clay near the creek and hauled it up the hillside in leather bags. He mixed the clay with water until it reached a thick paste consistency, then troweled it over the stones and organic material. The clay sealed everything, creating a continuous surface that blocked drafts completely. The work was tedious and dirty. His hands were raw from handling stone and clay. But slowly, methodically, the pit transformed from a rough excavation into an insulated chamber that would hold heat like a pottery jug holds water. The roof structure began with logs laid across the width of the pit. Resting on the stone walls and anchored at the back by the earthen bank itself, Eamon selected straight pine logs, each about 6 inches in diameter, and spaced them 18 inches apart. They spanned the 10-foot width easily, creating a framework strong enough to walk on. Across these support logs, he laid split planks he had hewn from a single large oak. The planks were rough, adzed flat on one side and left round on the other. He overlapped them like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. Water would run down the surface without penetrating to the interior. He pegged each plank to the underlying logs, creating a solid deck. Over the planks, he laid sections of bark he had peeled from dead birch trees. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He overlapped the bark sheets in multiple layers, each layer offset from the one below. Any water that penetrated the first layer would be stopped by the second or third. The next layer was animal hides. Eamon had been saving deer and elk hides from the previous autumn's hunting. He had scraped them clean, but left them untanned, keeping them supple with regular applications of brain-tanned oil. He stretched these hides over the birch bark, overlapping the edges and securing them with wooden pegs driven through the bark into the planks below. The hides added another waterproof layer and provided significant insulation. Over everything, he spread clay mixed with chopped grass. The grass reinforced the clay, preventing it from cracking as it dried. He applied the mixture in a layer roughly 2 inches thick, working it into every seam and gap. When dry, this clay layer would be hard and waterproof, shedding rain while adding thermal mass to the roof. Finally, over the clay, he piled the dirt he had excavated from the pit itself. He mounded it 18 inches deep across the entire roof, sloping it gently from back to front for drainage. He seeded this dirt with grass, scattering seeds he had collected from meadow grasses. The grass would root and grow, creating a living roof that would stabilize the soil and blend the structure into the hillside. When finished, the roof was nearly invisible. From 50 yards away, the pit den looked like a natural feature of the landscape, just another bump in the hillside. Only the small entrance gave any indication that a structure existed. Owen Pritchard visited one final time before the first snow. He stood looking at the completed shelter with an expression somewhere between confusion and disgust. "You have built yourself a tomb," Pritchard said. "When winter comes and that entrance is buried in snow, you will be trapped inside with no way out. You will suffocate or starve." "The entrance faces south and angles down," Eamon said. "Snow will not block it. And if I am trapped, at least I will be warm while I wait." Pritchard shook his head and rode away. The first snow fell in mid-November, light flurries that dusted the ground and melted by afternoon. December brought heavier storms, accumulating snow in layers that compressed into a solid pack. Eamon spent these weeks testing his shelter, learning its characteristics, understanding how it responded to different conditions. The interior stayed remarkably stable. Outside temperatures dropped to well below freezing, but inside the pit den the temperature hovered around 45 degrees with no fire at all. Just the residual warmth from the earth itself, trapped by layers of insulation, kept the space above freezing. When Eamon built a small fire in the stone hearth he had constructed against the back wall, the temperature rose quickly to a comfortable 60 degrees and stayed there for hours after the fire died. He needed far less firewood than he had used in the cabin with Peter. A fire the size of his 2 fists, burning for an hour, would keep the pit den warm for an entire evening. The heat had nowhere to escape. It was trapped by earth. Above, earth behind, stone and earth on the sides, and the small entrance that released only minimal air. Luther Hayes stopped by in late December. He descended into the pit den and stood looking around with obvious surprise. "It is warm in here," Hayes admitted, "warmer than my cabin with twice the fire." "The earth holds the heat," Eamon said. "The air outside can be as cold as it wants. The ground does not care." Hayes examined the construction, running his hand over the clay-sealed walls, looking up at the layered roof barely visible in the dim light from the entrance. "I will not say you were right," Hayes said. "Not yet. Winter has barely started. Wait until February. Wait until the real cold comes. Then we will see if this hole still keeps you alive." Hayes left, but his visit marked a change. Word spread that Eamon's pit den actually worked. Other trappers and settlers began asking questions. How deep did he dig? What held up the roof? How did he prevent water from pooling inside? Eamon answered honestly. He was not trying to keep secrets. If others wanted to build similar structures, that was their choice. He simply wanted to survive. January 1779 was cold but manageable. February brought something different. The temperature dropped and stayed down. Clear skies at night meant radiative cooling that pulled heat from everything exposed to the sky. Daytime highs barely reached zero. Nighttime lows plunged to 20 below and colder. Then, on February 23rd, the sky turned white. The storm came from the northwest, a wall of cloud that covered the entire visible horizon. Snow began falling before noon, heavy, wet flakes that accumulated quickly. By evening, 6 inches covered the ground. By midnight, a foot. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally, piling it in drifts that buried smaller trees and filled ravines. Eamon retreated into his pit den and sealed the entrance with a hide flap weighted with stones. The storm lasted 11 days. Eamon knew this only because he marked each dawn on a stick with his knife, scratching a line into the wood when dim light appeared at the entrance. Time became irrelevant underground. There was no day or night in any meaningful sense, only the steady, comfortable darkness of the pit den. He ventured outside twice during the first 3 days, forcing his way through accumulating snow to gather firewood he had stacked nearby under a crude shelter. Each time, the wind tried to knock him down. The cold bit through his heaviest clothes within minutes. He grabbed what wood he could carry and retreated back into the earth. After the 3rd day, he stopped going out entirely. The snow was too deep, the wind too fierce, the cold too dangerous. He had enough firewood inside to last 2 weeks if he was careful. He had dried meat, parched corn, and water from melted snow. He could wait. Inside the pit den, life continued with surprising normalcy. He kept a small fire burning constantly, feeding it, a few sticks every few hours. The fire was tiny compared to what he would have needed in a cabin, but it kept the interior temperature around 55 degrees. Warm enough to sit comfortably without heavy furs. Warm enough to sleep without fear of freezing. The wind howled above ground, but he heard it only as a distant, muffled sound, like listening to a storm from inside a cave. The earth absorbed the sound along with the cold. Snow piled on top of the roof, adding insulation. The more it snowed, the warmer the pit den became. He had time to think during those 11 days. About Peter, freezing in a cabin that could not hold heat. About all the frontier settlers who died each winter because they built structures that fought against nature instead of working with it. About how simple the solution was once you stopped assuming that shelter had to be above ground. On the 9th day, he heard a sound that did not come from the storm. A cracking noise, distant but distinct. Then another. He recognized it immediately. Timber breaking under load. Somewhere out in the storm, a cabin roof was collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow. He thought about Luther Hayes and Owen Pritchard. He thought about Isaac Brennan, a young trapper who had a cabin 3 miles east. He thought about all the people scattered across these mountains, sitting in their proud structures that stood tall and caught the full force of the storm. On the 11th day, the wind stopped. The sudden silence woke Eamon from sleep. He lay in the darkness listening to nothing, then crawled to the entrance and pushed aside the hide flap. Sunlight poured in, brilliant and blinding after days of dimness. The sky was perfectly clear. The temperature outside felt even colder than during the storm, but the air was still. The blizzard had passed. Eamon climbed out into a transformed world. Snow covered everything in drifts that reached above Eamon's waist in places. The landscape was unrecognizable, familiar, landmarks buried or transformed. He stood outside his pit den and looked across the white expanse, seeing no smoke from any nearby cabins. That absence told a grim story. He found Luther Hayes 3 days later. Hayes had survived, but his cabin had not. The roof had partially collapsed under snowload on the 7th day of the storm. Hayes had spent the remaining 4 days huddled in a corner with his largest fire, burning furniture and interior planks to stay alive. When Eamon arrived, Hayes was preparing to abandon the structure entirely. "Your hole saved you," Hayes said without preamble. "I would be dead if I had not kept my fire going every moment. I burned everything I own. You probably slept comfortably." "I was warm," Eamon admitted. "I used less wood in 11 days than you burned in 1. Hayes looked at the damaged cabin, then back at Eamon. "Teach me how to build what you built. I will not spend another winter like this." Owen Pritchard had not survived. Eamon found him a week after. The storm ended. The cabin door was frozen shut from the inside. Pritchard was near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by ashes. He had burned everything flammable, trying to stay warm. It had not been enough. Isaac Brennan appeared at Eamon's pit den in late March as the snow finally began to melt. Brennan was young, barely 25, and he had survived the blizzard through sheer luck. His cabin had held together, and he had enough firewood stacked inside to maintain a fire throughout the storm. But the experience had terrified him. "I want to build what you built," Brennan said. "Show me how." Eamon spent the next month helping Brennan excavate and construct a pit den similar to his own. The work went faster with 2 men, and Eamon had refined his techniques through experience. He knew which shortcuts worked and which details were critical. Brennan's shelter was completed by early May. Word spread through the survivor community that summer. The blizzard of 1779 had killed dozens of settlers across the Appalachian frontier. Those who lived through it were eager to adopt any technique that improved their odds. By autumn, 5 more pit dens had been constructed in the region, each built by men who had nearly frozen in traditional cabins. Luther Hayes built his pit den with obsessive attention to detail, improving on Eamon's design by adding a second chamber for food storage that stayed cool year-round. Others adapted the concept to their specific needs and locations. The basic principle remained constant: build into the earth, use the ground's stable temperature, trap heat with layers of insulation, create a shelter that works with nature instead of fighting it. Eamon Crawford never claimed credit for inventing the technique. Indigenous peoples had used similar methods for generations. He had simply been willing to learn from what worked and abandon what failed.